July morning in the Isle of Man. And what I'm going to do first is just run through briefly some ideas really around the subject and some of the discussions I think we're going to have, and then try and move reasonably quickly into the panel discussion. So Rebecca, if you can move that on one. So yeah, we started out with Going Digital as a title, and I think over the last few months, one of the things we've realised is that's perhaps a bit out of date, really. I think we've all had to, one way or another, go digital to keep running our businesses, and if that is to say, if we weren't already. And I think really the theme that we'd like to sort of explore is a forward-looking view of how we're all going to thrive in an economy which is digital by default, and how that relates to all sorts of different aspects of the way that the way that we conduct our businesses as employees, the way we seek to win business, the way we and also the way business is regulated. So if you move on one. So this is our panel, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome all of them. So we have obviously Rebecca is hosting us today from Chamber of Commerce. We have Karen from the CEO of the Financial Services Authority, who I'm really delighted is able to join us to bring a sort of regulators and a sort of perhaps more, and to some degree, an international perspective to the discussion. Dick, who we saw last night receiving being entertained by the Lieutenant Governor to celebrate his MBE, is the former CEO of the Isle of Man Ship Registry, and somebody I've certainly known for a great many years as a colleague and client, who has taken an organisation all the way through from really very much a very traditional paper-based organisation right through to probably one of the most sophisticated and digitally enabled ship registries in the world, and has done that for all the right reasons, and I think can tell us a lot about what the benefits are in terms of being able to grow a business, especially from the Isle of Man. Jane Hartley is the production director here at PDMS, and very much, I mean, in the title there we were talking about tales from the front line. Well, I think Jane will be able to bring a lot of tales from the front line of working on big projects with clients all over the world, but particularly here in the island, in the UK and internationally, on that transformation journey with all of its challenges, technical and cultural. Jim Rawson, again, very pleased to have Jim here. Jim heads up our digital design team, and again has been, for many years now, working always on the other sort of front end, really, of trying to make systems not just functional, but also fun and good to use and attractive, from a human perspective. And Dan, as a more recent member of our team, works with Jim, and Dan is an expert on user experience, user design, and sort of and the analytics side of things. And has brought a lot of kind of know-how to our team in some of the more kind of up-to-date aspects of user experience and digital design. And also the analytics side. So I'm very pleased to have all of those people. And if we move on one. So just the next couple of slides, and it is only a couple of slides, are really intended to just get people thinking a bit and to sort of, to really set the scene in terms of some of the headings. And the first heading of digital workforce is probably, well, I think in a way what the last few months have done is they've forced really pretty much all of us to become a digital workforce, both whether our roles are as managers and leaders, or whether it's just our day-to-day working environment. And I think there are some things which have worked well. There are some businesses which are better suited to this, but it's been really interesting to see how all sorts of different businesses have adapted, and what light that's perhaps thrown on things like barriers to progress. Why do some businesses or organizations very resistant to moving to more technology-based ways of working, whereas others are very embrace it very readily, for example, and the change that having to, the necessity being the mother of invention, if you like, how that has affected what people think and how people manage is an interesting theme, and I think one will explore. And I think the point there in yellow about digital being a set to things, not people, is one of the themes that I think we've really explored, is the idea that what digital is, people sometimes think that digital transformation or automation and so on is really is mostly a threat to people's jobs, and whereas really it's not so much that. I think it's much more of a threat to physical objects, documents, wet signatures, pieces of paper, and even things like CDs, if you're looking in terms of things like music and that kind of thing. And actually the ability to do business without those things puts more emphasis on the skills and role of the people. And obviously there's the whole idea that the idea of, or the whole topic of regulation as well. I think one final thing on this slide is that doing business with people you already know has been mostly something people have been able to do quite well. But how has it affected winning new business? Is it, the thriving, not surviving aspect is really interesting as well. So move us on, Rebecca. Here's just some statistics. We picked these statistics all up from they came from a report which was published by the World Economic Forum, and reflects pretty much our own experience actually, and anecdotally what other employers locally have said to me as well, which is that a really significant proportion of employees don't want to just come back to working in the office in the way they historically have done, nor do they necessarily all want to stay at home. But that hybrid model, which is with greater flexibility and probably a more results-based approach to their work, is a really strong trend. The implications in terms of how managers and organizations need to operate and what people are looking for from them in terms of support and so on is, that's also been a really interesting aspect of this, and in terms of it really highlighting the effort you need to make to retain that kind of team cohesion and sense of well-being and so on, a sense of belonging at a time where you're not seeing one another as much. And then the final point there about skills, and I think in some ways that's one of the most important things, because if we're going to have a workforce which is not adversely affected by digital and automation and those kind of things, then people need different skills and in order to thrive in that world. Next one, Rebecca. So, and then from a business perspective, and here it's just some very simple things really, but thinking in terms of business transactions, processes, and so on, in terms of information and single sources of the truth, data, in other words, rather than the documents or artifacts, which historically we might have thought of as the primary source of the truth, is that signed document. Whereas I think we need to think of documents and things you print out really very much, or web pages on which you see data or whatever. They're just temporary views onto information, and actually the role of a piece of paper there is it becomes much less important and much less relevant if you think of it just as a printout of a data which is held and secured elsewhere. And obviously this question of bandwidth, not location, I think one of the things that almost anybody will say is that the technology is great so long as you've got the bandwidth, and actually being able to be location independent is very dependent on that core utility infrastructure which we all need to have. And I think from an Isle of Man point of view, I think there are many benefits for the Isle of Man in being a place where it's easy to do digital business, and that removes a lot of the constraints of our geographical location, but we have to have the infrastructure to make that seamless. And then the final point there about design is really just about the way that businesses design the way they operate. And I think, again, a lot to think about there, and in terms of how we use the office space that we're not, that people don't necessarily want to spend as much time in. What are the, what do we need to think about in terms of the way our systems operate, and you know, how joined up they are, and ultimately, how do we ensure that the culture of the businesses that we, you know, that we work in adapts so that people, be it people who work there or people who you know, are our customers, really thrive, and that the systems, or the digital systems, are designed around the needs of the people we want, that we work with and work for. So reckon next one, and this is the last slide actually, and this is the point about regulation. And I think I personally think this is a really important point anyway, but particularly I think here in the Isle of Man, where we have a lot of regulated business, and I think the ability to work together to ensure that both industry and government create an environment, and regulation is part of it, it's not the only part of it, and the point about infrastructure was important as well, but that we have an environment in which is digital by default in terms of how people can operate. And I think that's really it in terms of the slides. So I'd like to start by perhaps bringing Dick in. And Dick, if you'd like to perhaps just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the ship registry, and then we, you know, and see how, because that kind of predates all this, and I'm interested what your reflections are on that now.
Yeah, morning everybody. Just to make it absolutely clear, I am the ex-director of the ship registry. So anything I've say here today is kind of finished around about May last year. But of course, I was in right from the start, and I met a very young Chris Gledhill. Just as an anecdote, if you like, I came back to the island in 1995, and I was used to a system of typewriters and 5 copies of certificates done with carbon paper in shipyards. And I came back to the island and I heard about this thing called the internet, and a young Chris Gledhill had set up some internet stations in a hotel in Douglas, and I went to see them and was completely blown away by the whole thing, not knowing what I was looking at. And I remember David North being with me and Chris saying, we were going, what is it? We have no idea. And Chris said, well, give me something to think, to get up on the screen. Give me a search. And we all looked at each other, and most people wanted to get, I don't know, some film star up there. And David North was having problems with a road. So he said, put Tar McAdam in there, and we had a look at something about roads. Well, that was genuinely my first sort of foray into the world of digital, if you like. And then I joined this incredible paper-based, ledger-based system where every piece of data was inconsistent. So a ship's length would be in that book at one length, in this book at another length, and nothing was correct. Everything that went out of the office went out 25% error. So we had this problem. And I was a surveyor, I probably shouldn't have got as involved as I did, but I just couldn't see this being right. Well, as I moved up through the organisation, we started to think about what the hell can we do with this problem that we have, and how do we get repeatability, how do we get accuracy of data, how do we get consistency, how can we work better? And that's when I travelled the world looking at, could I buy something off the shelf? And then we got in touch with PDMS, and we looked at a system which we had to design from the base up, not to replicate what we were doing then, filling in ledger books, but to think about what we could be doing in 10 years' time, and build a system with a platform that could do what we don't even know we need to do yet. And I think that's where this came around. So in a way, it was initially from an operator perspective, how do we get accuracy? How do we get consistency of data? How do we have single entry that talks to each other? How do we get integration of systems, in other words? How do we get efficiency? How do we get security? How do we hold all this stuff off site? Because if we have a fire and all our ledger books go, we've kind of had it. So everything initially from the operator perspective about us getting better. And then as we grew through this or went along this digital journey, I'll probably use the J word a bit too much, but then it was about what does the customer see? What's the customer journey in all of this? And we actually mapped customer journey. We held seminars where we said, what does it feel like from a customer's perspective? And actually we were doing okay, but there were little tweaks that we could have done, which eventually developed into digital certificates. Instead of sending pieces of paper all around the world, the courier companies and the airlines make a lot of money. Our seafarers in the Philippines can have them like that. And then we can have proper digital certificates on them. Then we don't need pieces of paper. And the world of shipping is run by pieces of paper. You get bureaucrats visit your ship the moment you dock and they want pieces of paper. And we had to turn the world, not just us in the ship registry, but we were kind of leading from this into how can the International Maritime Organization accept something that isn't a piece of paper? Because Mr. Harbour Master in Lagos still wants a piece of paper. But slowly we've come around to that. Online processes. I'm a simple guy. I know if I buy a book or a tape or whatever from a CD from Amazon, I've got the Amazon experience. I've got an account that tells me what I've bought. So I would say to Chris's team, give my guys the Amazon experience. Let's have a system where they know what they've ordered, what they've paid for, what they owe us, pay online, and we got there. And now we're in, well, the ship registry is in this sweet spot where as soon as COVID hit, and nobody had ever planned for something like this, they all walked away with their laptops, went home, and carried on seamlessly for the clients, and were incredibly productive. And now I guess they'll be looking, I mean, I talked to Cameron and the team, they'll be looking at a different way of working in the future. So if that's what you want, that's our digital journey. First of all, from an operator perspective, how do we buy the staff in on this? Well, they want to come along with this journey. They're sick of getting things wrong. They're sick of ships getting detained because the certificate's in error. They want to work in a better system. And when we started the system, we put nothing in that was historic. We brought the team in, we got them to start putting the current ships on the register and logging that data in themselves. So they own that data. We came in at the weekend, we did a Saturday, Sunday. It was a kind of team bonding thing. And from then on, they start to trust the systems. They start to feel a part of the system. And they gave me the old ledger books back within a couple of weeks. I gave them 3 months to double entry. They gave me them back. Please put them in a museum. This is not the way we want to work. And then the staff realized that we can do more with less. So they're not looking at redundancy. We're looking at growing the register with this same team, this core team. And that's what the whole sales pitch was really. And I didn't have to buy them in. They were on it right from the start, building the whole thing, designing the whole thing with the organization PDMS as partners in this. So I think we didn't plan to do it so that something like COVID would hit and we'd be in a great place to be. But boy, were we in a great place to be. So that's in a nutshell.
Yeah, no, thank you, Dick. And actually, I quite like to bring Jane in on that because part of Jane's job has been working with we're running the teams that work with you, but also working with other similar organisations in other parts of the world. Not all of whom have perhaps had quite such a joined up approach to the business change aspects of this. And do you have any kind of observations on that about the do's and don'ts of motivating the team to people like us?
Yeah, I think that there were some really interesting points there that Dick was mentioning. And the things I was really interested in was the stuff about starting new, starting fresh, and not bringing any of the old stuff with them. And often the old things, the things that have formed parts of the organisation, of the organisation's processes, and of people's jobs, become blockers to transformation because they are perceived to have such value. They must have value because they're physical entities in many cases, and so much hard work has gone into generating them and producing them that they are perceived to have great value. And that then becomes a blocker to transformation, to digital transformation, because everybody wants to bring that stuff with them. It's the security that comes with it. If I bring this with me, it's all the hard work that we've done for years, and it must come with us as we start this new digital journey. And it can actually be a blocker to that transformation and to that change, because it adds an awful lot more complexity, and it doesn't necessarily bring the value that you perceive it will bring when you make that transition into the digital world. So that was a really interesting point that Dick was already on that, right, years ago, recognising that point. So that's really crucial, I think, into making a success of digital projects and that transformation. There's also the element that you touched on right at the beginning, Chris, around digital being a threat to things rather than to people. And that's definitely true, that people do feel a sense of threat when we start talking about automating, introducing systems that will make everything go way faster. And there is a real feeling that there is a threat to jobs. And I think the key bit is getting people to understand that there will be more that will be available. The organisations will have the capacity to do more and see more, because they won't be doing the same day-to-day administrative activities that they're currently doing. So I thought that's a really important point as well. And I think also the idea of bringing people on board. An organisation's memory is so long, and the way people do things, the way we do things around here, is such a strong tie, that getting people to free themselves from that organisational memory and imagine new ways of doing things is really tricky. And it's very difficult as well when it is coupled with a fear that this might change their job, or it might change whether they have a job in the future. So that's a real blocker to that kind of digital transformation as well. So I've got really interesting points there that we see almost on a day-to-day basis with our customers when we're trying to deliver those software solutions into those organizations.
It's an interesting one, actually. One of the things I've realized in similar conversations recently is perhaps why so much transformation happens through disruptive organizations. Because actually, if you think about the Isle of Man Ship Registry, the Isle of Man Ship Registry was effectively a disruptor in the ship registry marketplace. You certainly disrupted the likes of the UK MCA a bit, and by that, I mean, I know, probably won't mind me saying this, but I know that they come across every now and again and look at the Isle of Man Ship Registry and scratch their heads a bit and say, how many ships do you manage? Where are your other offices? Where are all the other floors of people that must be doing that work? And of course, you were able you were in a position to be a disruptor because you weren't right at the top. You weren't at Panama, or what?
Yeah.
You have everything to gain and a lot less to lose, both as an organisation and as individuals. And I think how to think for an organisation when it's considering digital transformation, it also has to consider what winning's all about, so that you can, you've got to look at it from the point of view of, and it's actually much easier to be positive about something where you're going to be moving up the rankings, rather than where you're just trying to prevent yourself getting knocked off the top, when you're going to be much more defensive. And I think that there's a real organizational mindset thing there that you need to consider right at the start.
Yeah. One other point I didn't mention there was that when we started the process, the business analyst part of it was a whole new world for me. And had we just tried to replicate our paper systems, we would have ended up with a digitized paper system. But the analyst that we got on board from GTS, as it is now, was tremendous in saying, well, what could you do? What will you be doing? Let's look to the future. Let's build with the future in mind, a future I had no idea about. But having a business analyst query and question everything that you're doing was it opened my mind completely into what we should be doing, what we could be doing. And rather than let's just get digitize that group, So that was a massive part of the journey. And I think between the GTS, I think it was Alan Sanford, was great because he comes in with the mindset of knowing nothing about shipping, but querying and questioning everything we do. And then we've got PDMS who are doing the technical parts of it, along with the business analysts. That was a triumvirate that really, really worked for me. It was and was proven to work. So that's a key part.
Oh, great. We have quite a few who will question absolutely everything, and it's mostly great, except when it's my decisions. Anyway, I'd quite like to bring Karen in at this point, really, just to sort of look at it. We get from the more from the regulatory standpoint, and then perhaps you have any reflections on things that have happened in terms of the crisis and how things that might have accelerated, but also more broadly the relationship between the regulator and the information, if you like.
Great. Thanks. Nice to join you. Dick, I really like to hear your journey's been fascinating because we are doing some system work as well, and you're a big advocate for change. So thank you. That was quite inspiring, actually. I really appreciated that. I mean, I think certainly, I attend a CSIRO network out of London virtually, and I think one of the participants a couple of calls back talked about COVID being the greatest digital officer they've ever employed, because it's really caused us to think about how we do our work so much differently. And I mean, quite a journey for the FSA, because when we left the office, we left with our laptops and conference call numbers. We had no way of connecting, using any sort of software or anything. We just had phone lines. And, we really quickly had to sort of re-vector, because it was really important to be able to keep connected to the team in a more virtual sense. And we followed the journey from, as many other organizations, from various different types of software for communication and teamwork. I think critical for us is one of the things, in terms of recognizing some of the gaps we had, was just having good basic infrastructure. And being able to use technology to help people do their work. And I think one of the things we have to recognize, perhaps, I don't know, Dick, in your experience, but the different ways of working. So, it's one thing for staff to be enabled a certain way, but when you have a governance structure that includes your board has to be equally enabled to be able to work with the teams in the same fashion. So you can't give your board second-class technology, because, particularly during a crisis, you have to be able to connect in the same sorts of way and be able to work in the same sorts of way. What's been interesting is that we've done a lot of work around our information assets, because that's been something we've done as part of the GDPR journey. And, as part of our BCP work for COVID is around what are our critical information assets. And that really brought us to think very long and hard about what's the most important information, our data, our assets that we have. And interestingly enough, it wasn't the paper files, like Dick. It wasn't the fact that when people went remote, they weren't scurrying back to the office to get their paper files. We were allowing access for people to get the second screen so they could work better on the system. Getting a decent chair at home, but it wasn't coming back to grab files. And it really helped to focus them on the criticality of information that you own as an organization. I think the other piece as well is that we've been working on a data system for some considerable time, and we've built the back office. And people adapting, using sort of, recording things online versus paper, but this really forced us to deal with doing things online and doing things by virtue of the system. So all our approvals, which would have hit my desk normally in a paper format with my wet signature, now became something I would go online, go into the system, the back office, and give my approval. I think as well, just being able to step back and look at what we do and how we work. And for example, a lot of things come across our desks of our staff. We get notification of things, we get things for consent, things for no objection. The extent to which we have it sort of systemized now, we're able to look in terms of what's the value added work we're doing in certain areas. And, the use of dashboards. So we've gotten a lot more savvy in using our dashboards and measuring, how we do work. And again, being off site and not having sort of paper that people just churn through and having to look to the system has been so valuable in sort of highlighting the critical work and what things really we touch, we do every day, our workflows. So fantastic. I would say lessons learned in terms of, what we've learned through the piece and what we don't want to lose is the fact that there's been a behavioral change in how we work, and we don't want to lose the good things that we've found about working remotely and using our digital information assets versus returning to back to paper. I think as well, we always have to recognize, and as a regulator, it's the privacy versus speed. And that was something really, really important to think about, because some of the technology wasn't as secure initially, but we had to consider how we best work around that, because you had to have, people were expecting us to do the same sorts of things in the same sorts of time frames. Are there new risks? I mean, the big thing about technology to introduce new risks, well, COVID-19 in terms of and the use of everyone being on technology introduced new risks around consumer protection, AML risks. And so we had to think about that from the perspective of a regulator. So, there's many, many things. I mean, I could go on because I think this is one of the things that I think we're all going to sit back and do at some time, is do a sort of a post-mortem on what we've learned through working remotely, using more technology, and how do we need to make changes in how we work going forward to be more accessible, more digitized, I guess, and more efficient. I think Dick's point in terms of the trade-offs in terms of people versus processes, just having access to sort of dashboards around work that we do is really highlighted to me. People want to be more efficient. They want to spend value added time. So there's things we've got to pull out of the system because it's not value added to what we're trying to achieve. So that's sort of my long-winded piece, but glad to take questions, comments.
Well, thanks for that, Karen. And I think that we'll come back to both because you've talked quite a bit there about your own organisation and its adaptation, and I think that theme is one that applies to all of us. And I think some of the points there about what people value and kind of picked up on some of the things that Jane and Dick had already said anyway. And also actually the point about including everyone. Actually, sometimes boards are last in line for technology. Mm-hmm. Because it's not necessarily seen as the most important thing for them, because they don't do the day job. And actually that has very much been highlighted by this process, is that you need those people who maybe haven't grown up with technology to the same extent in their working lives as well. To have more senior people like that it's just as important. But I'd actually like to pick up on something that's from the chat there. That's I think Andrew Dawson has put something up about AI and electronic processes, and I think really picking up perhaps on some of the thoughts on the introductory slides as well around the relative role of automation and human input. And I think it's I don't know if anybody, Jim, maybe if you have any reflection on this from your point of view, from the design of systems point of view, because I personally have a real kind of beam my bonnet about this one, because I think that technology is there for people, not the other way around. And I think there's a real tendency for technology businesses, and we're one of them, to try and sell the technology as if that was the answer, rather than sell the impact of the technology on people. And I think one of your roles in PDMS is always to try and keep us honest in terms of making designing for people. And again, interested in any reflections on that, even around accessibility and those kind of things.
Yeah. I mean, I think Karen also mentioned accessibility in her sort of perspective on things there. I think that's web accessibility is something that's sort of always been around since the internet's been around, really. But I think as people have been sort of many people have been forced into sort of working remotely that perhaps haven't done before. And I think that's something which has become very pressing. Obviously, sort of UK regulation for public sector bodies already states that those services have to be accessible. But I think that we could start to see that kind of roll more into the private sector as well, as Chris said in the beginning, sort of by default, because we have to. It's the right thing to do. And I think just in more general terms, in terms of technology and people, it's a sort of human-centered design process is always the best thing to do, really, because the technology is just an enabler. It's there to help us get done what we need to get done. And if we can bring the focus around to people and just use the technology in that way, I think we'll always end up with the good results and happier people, happier customers and happier staff.
Yeah, I've got the idea, the sort of conceit that HI, as in human intelligence, is way better technology than AI, and our systems should be there to enhance that. And I think Andrew's comment, he picked up on uses the expression real intelligence, and I think that's really what we're talking about.
Yeah,
the real is ours.
Yeah, and I think that the other thing I've been thinking about quite a bit is just sort of in terms of, and I think Dick mentioned something about sort of business analysis. another word for that is user research, and being able to really understand users in light of what's happening at the moment is fairly crucial for businesses to transform, because you know, everyone has sort of changed. We've all changed in our habits, our behaviours, our opinions, our daily activities in lots of different ways, and inevitably that means the way we interact with services and products and things is going to change as well. And for some businesses, maybe the things that they once considered their core products and services might not be their core products and services anymore. They might have to change those, and understanding their customers and users is going to be key, really, to help them make that transition, I think.
If I could just jump in there as well, just in relation to what Jim's talking about there, you know, over the last 10 to 15 years, I've worked as a business analyst, that's what I did, and the customers that we spoke to, when businesses were trying to design systems for use, it was for systems for use for their back office situations for their staff to use, and so the customer was considered a staff member within the organisation, and so the requirements were around what the organisation needed to do, what that staff member needed to do. So it's a very internal perspective, an internal focus. That is completely changed now. And now when we talk about the business analysis, the user research, we're talking about who is the end consumer of this service. And it's important to have the focus on that end user to really understand what they're trying to achieve, because that's where the value is. And then the organisation can provide that service, but it's got to be to meet the requirements of the consumer of the service. So it shifted it. So the perspective now, when you're carrying out the business analysis or user research, is more external focus, because your customers, your consumers, they're expecting those services to be online. They don't expect to have to pick up a phone or write a letter. You know, they expect to be able to find your website and go get involved in that particular service offering by access through your website. So it's very different perspective. So the key there is to always remember who the end user is, and don't get too caught up in how the organisation does business now, or the people that are using that system now. You've got to focus on that ultimate consumer.
Yeah, thank you. And I quite like to bring Dan in at this point, because Dan's probably the only digital native on the panel, and I think I'm really interested in how baffled are you by the fact that any of this is even an issue?
No, not really. I think I think yeah, one of the good, if anything good, can come out of COVID in the context of business. I think it's acted, I guess, as a catalyst for conversations like this to be had, I suppose. It's interesting, like I think everyone's touched on it already, but from a design perspective, I think, like Jim touched on, the user-centered approach, which in the past, I guess, has been one of many different design methodologies you could adopt, but I think it's become pretty much essential over the course of the COVID crisis. I think people are absolutely reliant on technology now, and especially with, like Jim mentioned, with the web accessibility. I think COVID has just brought to light anyone that perhaps didn't think it was particularly important or didn't prioritise it. I think it's made it abundantly clear that it's pretty important, and it doesn't actually, accessibility isn't necessarily about catering to a few people. It actually just makes user experience better for everyone, which yeah, again, I think has become pretty clear. Yeah, but no, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised that this is a conversation everyone's having now. I think it's a good thing. If anything, I think it's a big positive. But yeah, and it's good from a design perspective as well.
Yeah, it's perfect. One of the questions on that's come in from James Morgan is a question, quite a specific question about tools and platforms, and I think it's you know, what software platforms we're using and so on. And I think the question mentioned C#, SP.NET, PHP, Laserfish and so on. And I think that I'd quite like to pick up on that a little bit, because actually there are lots of tools out there, and some of the ones mentioned in the question are coding languages. Laserfish is a document management and process management product, so it's quite a developed piece of software. But I think one of the things that we would always want to say is that is really important from a practical point of view, and that is very much a practical, detailed question, is actually not to worry too much about the building blocks. C# or PHP and ASP, they're all tools you can use to deliver the outcomes you've decided you want. And a lot of the points that Jim and Dan were just making are all about, and I think also what we said about and that the analysis process. It's about deciding what your outcomes look like and what you want, and how both in terms of how you're creating productivity, what the core information assets are, and so on. And actually, most of the process, that's the really important stuff that determines success in digital products and digital transformation, is very little to do with the choice of tools you eventually use to implement. Actually, most of them will do the job one way or another. And it's deciding what the job is. In other words, the architecture as opposed to the building is really, really the key. And I think the more organizations recognize that it's not really about procuring products, it's actually about essentially designing and developing the way that your organization operates. A little anecdote actually from I think it might actually been in relation to the ship registry system in the early days. I remember talking to a very senior person not in your organization, Dick, but in government, who's no longer there. But we were having a conversation about change requests and about and about whether they were a good thing or not. And we'd put a system in, and we'd had, I think, 190 change requests in the year on your system. I'm pretty sure it was. And we'd had this nice chat in this review about how I think it was ISD at the time, whatever, how they'd recently got ISO 9001, the quality assurance and standard, and as we had, and we were chatting about that, and then we came to the nub of the matter, which was all of these change requests and how that made our system, or your system, the worst system in government.
That's an old chestnut.
and it was a worse system because it didn't have to be changed so much. And the conversation, and I said to Peter Clark, it was actually, and I said to him, yes, but don't you think that 9001 implies that you have continuous improvement? Isn't that something you're proud of? And he said, absolutely. And I said, well, how can you continuously improve without changing your system? Your system is your business. And I think and it was a bit of one of those moments of, oh, right, okay. But it really comes right to the heart of the matter that an awful lot of the time, our customers or people wanting to do change want to have that one shot. I'm going to buy the best system, the best of breed, and then that'll be it. I've solved my digital transformation problem. Yeah. And of course, that's complete nonsense. You're in the world we're talking about, a digital by default environment, your system is your business. They're not, and if your business is going to improve, then your system has to be part of that process of change. And so the question about tools and platforms is actually all about, I would reframe that and say it's really all about making sure you have the right capability and partners to be able to, and skills to be able to use the tools you choose to continuously improve and develop what you do, to remain competitive, to remain productive, and to keep up with or to maximize the benefits of that. Again, from your point of view, Dick, how frustrated did you get with the fact
it's a fantastic topic, because from their perspective, that was their belief. But from ours, once we built up a relationship with the developer, with PDMS, if we waited to spec, they wanted us to build a lot of changes in one go. So it's like saying to your wife, you can't have a new dishwasher yet because I'm going to build a new kitchen in 5 years' time. And you've got to find all the faults and we'll put your new kitchen in 5 years' time. So they wanted us to bank it and do one change request, but we want it to be completely fluid so we can continuously improve. And that was a real old chestnut for a long, long time. But the other thing is, if I spec a change request, or Dave Morton, who was working for us at the time, spec the change request, we get given what we've spec, but we don't know what we want. So for us, once we got this trust with PDMS, and trust is a huge word in all of this, I think I want to do this, sit down with your guys, and they say, well, we can do it this way, show us what it looks like, right, that's maybe a bit this, a bit of that, an iterative approach. We get what we wanted without having to write down in 5 pages a tight specification. If you were going to build a house and you've just gone through it, Chris, I bet you didn't write that spec on day one and get exactly what you wanted. You go through a process and maybe that doesn't look right. And that's what we got to at PDMS. But it was a world away from what government wanted us to do. Bank all your changes and do one a year.
Yeah, I mean, you did the analogy with building a house. You're right. I've just recently gone through the process of designing and building a house, and one of the things I knew from the very start was how little I knew about that. So you know you're going to rely on other people's expertise, and therefore the most important thing in that is trust. And I think that relationship. But actually, it kind of leads us on to something which I want to pick up again from the floor a little bit here, which is all about taking what people have learned in terms of digital. And I think this is a question for you, Karen, to start with at any rate, because it's about saying, well, what are we about formalizing at a jurisdictional level potentially what we've learned in terms of digital practices, in terms of client onboarding, things like and it's certainly one of the things I want to know what you think about. So.
Well, it's a couple of things, and just on the client onboarding, it's something that has been, something sitting with all of us for a while, and I think there's a real hunger for a once and done approach. I think that's part of the issue, because the guidance around sort of electronic onboarding, electronic CDD, it's permissible, but the issue is there's no one technology that supports it. And FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, has done a lot of work around the whole issue of digital ID. And I think it's the fact that to be able to replicate that across. Now, one of the challenges we have as a jurisdiction, but Dick, make me think about things a bit differently, is the fact that, domestically, could we do that? Yes, for sure. Domestically, yes, but a lot of our business is outward facing, it's international. So what would be sort of a credible sort of e-solution here may not be acceptable, adaptable other places. But the ship registry is quite an interesting example in that regard. So how do you build credibility around electronic or digital ID that's acceptable globally? So I think, has it caused us to change? Well, I think it's caused us to refocus on that, because absolutely, if you think about all the things we talk about with firms, it's around the verification process for onboarding clients and the ongoing sort of verification process, because when you think about financial services, it's all built on trust, and the extent to which things are tamper-proof, are credible, are reliable, replicable as well. And I think those are critical things. So before the lockdown, we had started a digital workshop group on onboarding and electronic ID, and we're going to obviously pick that up again. I think the thing I have learned through the crisis around this is that I've been dealing a lot with other regulators, because we clubbed together to find out what we're doing and where we're up to. And I think a lot of my colleagues globally are really looking at joint ventures with universities, academics, to help really move these things along with firms. It's something, when you think about comfort zone for regulators, probably not our comfort zone in terms of digitalization and technology. So you can't go it alone. I think that's one of the things I've learned. You just can't go it alone. Buy the expertise or partner with the expertise, because Otherwise, you're going to be caught in a bit of a churn if you stick with just your own organization trying to solve for these really bigger issues. So I think that's where, so we're going to come back to the issue again with our workshop, but I think it's a matter of clubbing together with others to really try and push this solution through, because I think it would be an incredible lift for many of our firms and license holders, and be really accelerating the change I think we need to see.
Does the question I have for you, Karen, is does the idea of if you like an Isle of Man digital identity for business purposes, a little bit along the lines of perhaps taking some of the ideas that Estonia have developed a whole step further, which is there's this concept of of having a digital citizenship, which allows you to do business with a jurisdiction or through a jurisdiction without ever having to go there. And I think that and for that to be something which sits outside of the individual the individual businesses' responsibility. So in other words, it's something that can be accepted across the entire financial services spectrum, for example. Now that sits outside of the current role of any regulator, but it's not something that couldn't be done. It's just, and similarly, there are lots of standards, particularly in the EU and so on, which we tend to lead on all this kind of thing, like the EIDAS standards and so on, where actually, the level that you need to go to for it to be legally acceptable, in fact, mandatory that you accept things as digital ID or digital signatures in Europe is already in place and could easily be adopted. And I kind of wonder whether that's been part of those discussions with the
and I think it's a bit an issue, Chris, if I might say, and you probably know this as well, that's been an issue of who owns it, who owns the file on that. So as a regulator, we'll be looking to whether or not it meets the criteria of being tamper-proof, all the credibility pieces, it can technology risk, all those things, but who owns the development of that? And that's been the issue, I think, and Chris, you probably would agree in terms of here. So it's the acceptability, and so it's a chicken and egg. So the regulator can sign off and agree that yes, this form of digital ID is acceptable for forms of due diligence, but again, and then how do you sort of roll that out in multitudes to the buy-in from the actual users of the digital ID? And that's really not the role of the regulator. And that's where I think it gets sort of stuck a bit in terms of it's agreeable to do, but how do you get sort of mass participation in it?
So is there potentially scope for a slightly different, for industry to take a slightly different view there about where it can collaborate around, around a number of organisations or even sectors getting together and saying, if we all work to this standard, would that be acceptable on, as a way to move the whole picture forward without it having to be actually owned by the regulator? Because I can see the problem of the rate of your organisation suddenly taking responsibility for digital IDs that people use to validate customer due diligence and KYC and so on. But obviously your role is to agree to whatever risk balance a particular organisation is taking. And if a group of organisations all agree to adopt the same standard, is that something that you would be comfortable with?
Yeah, no, I think the regulator will always have some level of role, but it's not going to drive the development and the adaptability piece of it, but be involved in terms of the risk assessment, adherence to international standards, because there are some good international standards and guidance around what's acceptable digital ID for the purposes of the AML. So very important that those, any solution, addresses the concerns and risks that would arise. So I think clearly it's a role for industry, absolutely, and always a role for the regulator, because at the end of the day, you want to make sure it's a solution that is deemed to be acceptable, because if it's acceptable here from a regulatory perspective, it should be acceptable other places as well. It's sort of doing the litmus test here. But
yeah, absolutely. And one of the interesting things, I'm going to pick on Dick a bit again here, because one of the things that has been really interesting to watch, specifically in the context of shipping, which is fundamentally international and is regulated through the IMO, is how in the time that we've worked together, it's gone from the IMO being a major drag as a regulator to being really the driver of, and I think the adoption of digital certificates, for example, was something which was essentially was in line with IMO guidance, and so do you feel that, what do you feel the change has been there, and how has that affected the industry, Dick?
Well, initially nobody was willing to jump in. No ship owner was willing to jump in and have digital certificates on board his ship, at the risk of arriving in a port and the harbour master saying, I'm detaining your ship because I don't agree with these digital certificates. I need a piece of paper. And there's, the difference in ports, from the super ports down to small ports in Africa or the Caribbean or wherever, is vast. And these harbour masters are all powerful. So for a ship to risk a detention because the company wants to change and move into a digital age, nobody was taking that step forward. But lobbying from governments and forward-thinking governments into IMO to say, look, we've got to get something that's acceptable, and the IMO actually backing that and putting out a spec of what was acceptable, that then goes out to all of the 130 member states as a diktat that says this, as if a ship presents digital certificate and it has 1, 2, and 3, then it's acceptable, and you can't detain the ship. And as soon as that happens, then it's shown that that ship complies with international standards and everybody's safe. It still took some brave movers to be the first movers, first adopters on this. And they did a small trial in Denmark for ferries between Sweden and Denmark. Well, that's nice and easy. Everybody's going to accept that. It's the first ship that goes into Bonny in West Africa or somewhere like that. Or some of the Black Sea states that like to find ships because they can monetize the arrival of ships. Those are the brave first adopters. But as soon as IMO had said it, then we could argue the point. Then we could. But it was an international agreement. This is what's acceptable. As soon as that was on the table, it was all changed, and then it was a Klondike rush to who could be the first and how much we could get, and we were ahead of that, and it was fantastic to say the Isle of Man and our clients, our big clients, are the first adopters of this. So that was superb. But we put ourselves in that position.
It's interesting though, because what you just described there was the regulatory organisation actually putting out a spec, and I think Karen's point about about what the role of the regulator is and what expertise they reasonably can draw on, and the need to partner with the technology sector, but also with their customers, if you like.
Yeah, and it didn't happen overnight. There was a lot of work behind the scenes at IMO to arrive at a spec that everybody was comfortable with, and quite frankly, none of us knew what good looked like. So they have to go to the universities, they have to go to the tech providers, they have to find something that everybody's in agreement that this will be acceptable. And as soon as they do that, well,
I think there's a bit of an argument there as well for if there is to be an overseeing, sort of one overarching body, that it would perhaps be something similar to like ICANN or the W3C, where, because it's so internet based, is that there's an element there of it's not all about, yes, the regulation is about the financial services and the KYC, but the underlying platform is always going to be the internet. So there's perhaps an element there where people like the W3C need to be involved, because they're the ones that have the experience of rolling out standards across jurisdictions for all sorts of other things, whether it's web accessibility or that kind of stuff. Those kind of technical standards. So there's perhaps some sort of work to be done there. I don't think that exists yet.
I think there's more. I think it's actually, and again, Jim, that's a very interesting observation, because one of the things that we've learned over the years is how often there are very well developed standards in parallel industries that people are completely unaware of. And so there are, and that actually an awful lot of the time the opportunity to really make a lot of change when you look beyond your own sector and see where standards have been are much better developed in things which are essentially very much parallel to that. And I think, and again, that's you know, the W3C is a good example of that, but I'm thinking, for example, in terms of telecoms, you know, the whole change from, you know, the whole infrastructure of telecoms was completely different from the IP infrastructure of the internet. They've completely merged now, but that process took a generation, really. Even and most of the reason why some of those things would took a long time were because telecoms engineers knew telecom standards, and software engineers knew software and IP standards, and there was very little overlap, and so you didn't get that cross fertilization. And I think that, you know, being prepared to just look over into other domains to see whether there's perhaps already really good work around standards for ID, for example, and because I think there actually is. I mean, I think if you take even things like OAuth and the standards that, you know, the way in which you can authenticate across lots of different major technology stacks using the OAuth standard, for example, adding more, you know, higher levels of authentication to that is actually a relatively straightforward thing to do if you take that standard, and you know, you've got compatibility almost out of the box there. But it takes another, there's an important kind of mental jump that people need to make, which is, and again, Karen, perhaps you'll correct me if I'm wrong here, but I kind of feel that there is a default position in a lot of organizations and in the process of regulation that paper is intrinsically safer than digital. I've seen it written down, you know, and so the idea that something's being done digitally actually introduces risk. But of course, it's being done digitally potentially introduces some risk, but it also eliminates an awful lot of risk. And I think that that an awful lot of the time, the things we've come to trust, you know, are not necessarily that good. You know, that utility bill that you turned up with and got notarized somewhere in Abu Dhabi or whatever it happens to be, it's not really a particularly secure thing. Yeah, it's just the thing you're used to trusting. And I think that aspect of this is really important as well. It's being prepared to question the things you've got used to trusting. Dick,
yeah. So one thing that's just come to mind when we were talking about the IMO, one of the big lobbies in the International Maritime Organization is the environmental impact of shipping, and one of the real levers that we were able to use as well was we're sending pieces of paper all around the world on aircraft. We send them to the seafarer. He then picks this piece of paper and he joins a ship, and the ship has to stop in a port, and then there's all these piles of paper arrive, and then they print them. The environmental impact of going digital is a really, really powerful lobby, because we stopped this paper chase, and for us it was huge. The courier companies were in our office all day, every day, collecting pieces of paper. You magnify that around the world for 130 different flag states, all doing this for the 50,000 ships that are on the water. It was massive. So with ISO 14001 and all the environmental standards that we can get, we've got to consistently and constantly try to reduce our environmental footprint. That's quite a powerful lobby for digitization, which I haven't included up to now. But yeah, that served us really, really well.
Yeah.
Chris, maybe I'll say, on your question about paper being safer, I think what has, as a regulator, I think paper has been comfortable. People are very comforted by having paper. And we talk a lot about corporate memory and having, you know, people want to dig out the archives of the file that, you know, because there's some precedent. I think that's a really hard thing to get over sort of psychologically for people, because, you know, we deal a lot with case law and history. And so getting people to leave behind legacy paper, like Dick, you guys did, and said, let's just move ahead from today forward, is extremely difficult. As I say, when we've been doing a lot of work on information assets and trying to, you know, sort of inventories of assets. But when the rubber hit the pavement, or rubber hit the road, and we had to go off site, all those things weren't important anymore, and we were able to function. So that was a really big teacher for us. So I think that people would have said paper is safer. I think the last 3 months have taught them that, you know, don't really need the paper at all. And I laugh because when I was at home, I love paper. I love paper. I like to write on paper. I like to take notes. And I realized that, of course, I didn't print at all when I was home, because we couldn't print. We're not allowed to print outside the office. And I took reams of notes. And I went through my notes coming back to the office. And, you know, I'm probably taking 4 pieces of paper of the hundreds of little notebooks I filled when I was at home, writing things down. And I went through them and said, you know, what was really important here? And so, you know, we were so capable of working without paper, and we just have to force that change. And this has really forced the change for us, I think, in terms of really moving. And we deal with large volumes of data, and the power of being able to organize your data in a fashion and to look about, as I say, where you're spending your time. It's just been really, really, you know, informative for myself and for the leadership team in terms of what are we actually doing with this paper when it comes across our desk. And now it's coming digitally, but now we can organize it digitally and look at it and say, what are we doing? How much time are we spending on this stuff?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? All this, the stuff, the point you made about making notes. I mean, probably an awful lot of us like to make notes. Sometimes it's to some extent it's about memory formation, isn't it? It's or it's a kind of doodling. It's just your own highlighting of what you're taking from, isn't it? And it's a bit like the point I made earlier on about printing something being what you're really doing is you're taking a screenshot when you print a piece of paper. If you think of it like that, if you think about the written as having a purpose for viewing, or for you, or even just at that human level for your own interaction with information, because it's a skill you happen to have, I think it feels very different then. There's nothing wrong with taking lots of notes, but you're right. I mean, I have many notebooks that I've put into places on the basis of files of paper, things I've printed out that I'm never going to look at because I don't remember what's in them, except when I have one of those really big clean outs when Jane's told me that my desk really is a disgrace and that she's not anymore. Then I'll do that big clear out and I'll spend a whole day going through, oh, that was really interesting, and wow, I know why I kept that, but I've never looked at it. You know what I mean? No. So, you know, it's a sort of it's that window, that real-time window on the world that is the both public internet, but also our corporate systems that give us that, you know, that really just, or that, and I think Amazon. I mean, Amazon, you know, they're one of those little disruptors that have become become a corporate behemoth that basically because they have been really, really good at stopping us having to keep pieces of paper, in my view. Because Amazon knows the addresses for everybody I have to send Christmas presents to. Yeah. And I don't have to go and dig it out of my address book. It's just there. And they also remind me what I bought them last year and the year before. Yeah. So, you know,
I think on that note about paper and how we like to print stuff out, we also, when we're doing digital transformation, when we're building software systems, we love to get people in a room for a workshop with post-it notes and paper and stickers on the walls, and it's a real collaborative activity. And you know, for me, it was one of the best parts of doing that job, getting people together and encouraging people to ask questions and challenge, and new ideas would be formed as people brought those ideas together in that collaborative form. With COVID, we all disappeared off home and had to discover, how do we work collaboratively? How do we share those experiences? How do we make sure that we create the same kind of, or we encourage the same creative environment where people can really engage in the process and understand the goal of what we're trying to achieve? And I think that is a challenge. And I think it's about understanding what tools are available, whether it's Microsoft Teams or Zoom or other technologies that are available to help people come together remotely and collaborate to have the same kind of success in that collaboration. And sometimes it's about confidence in the ability to use the new tool. You know, if I like to write post-it notes and stick them on the wall as process flows, how do I do that? How do I learn how to do that as part of using an online tool that has the same brings the same benefit to the group and gives people the same opportunity to contribute? So it's about understanding what tools are available and building people's confidence in those tools so that we can create the same kind of collaborative environment to encourage the discussion and debate that leads to building those good software solutions and ultimately to that digital transformation.
Yeah, yeah, thank you for that. And I think, and I think that kind of picks up on the point that in the original slides as well, about the, I think it was 69% of people who whose take homes is that they want to build, more digital skills. It's that they've realised what they can do, but they've also perhaps become more willing to see learning those techniques and learning how to do things better as being a necessary and worthwhile thing. And I think in this would kind of in the context of the digital workforce and blended working and all those kind of things, that becomes the benefit to me as an employee, or as a worker, if you like, of being able to have to be more flexible. And the corollary of that, if I can work from home, and that's fine, but I still need to be able to be productive and work with the rest of my team from home and design. And so I need the skills to make so that people don't feel that I'm a drag on that process. And I think there's something in it for everyone at that point, isn't there? Suddenly it's a more trusting management style, one which is a more flexible one. In return for that, you're going to have the skills to work effectively in that environment. I think that's, to me, feels like yeah.
Chris, I would just, I mean, Jane as well, I think one of the things, thinking about how we work more collaboratively, we were doing some workshops off site, obviously on our meeting, and that was a little bit more challenging because for the very reason you've said, in terms of the sticky notes and sort of the whiteboarding and things like that. But the thing that's been so I think enchanting about this is just the access to people, different kinds of expertise more readily, where you might spend months trying to get someone to a meeting, to come over, to talk to your team about something, to impart some information, to leave. It's, how's next week look? Oh, I can zoom in this. It's been incredible. So we've really think about the Isle of Man and how we've been able to expand our network by virtue of the fact we just can collaborate globally. And I was due March 31st to be in New York City for a meeting of all regulators around innovation and technology. And of course we didn't go, obviously, but it was 120 of us on a call. And we all joined in by a call, and we shared slides, and we talked about experience, and that was a conference that was a year in the making. This was a big deal, pulling us all together. And so, we've got to have learned something, and we can learn more because we have access to so many more people, expertise, and think about joint venturing by using technology. So it's the whole new world. It should really be for all of us in many ways.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think one of my own experiences with that, it is very similar. Is in some respects, the last couple of months have been one of the most actually productive periods of my whole working life, because I haven't had to get on planes to have conversations with people internationally, and that has massively increased the number of conversations I've been able to have, and also it's been great for my personal well-being, actually. And actually, there's a comment Chris Till, I think, has picked up on this question of well-being, not and in the context of effects on using paper, reading screens, and so on. And I think as with all the things we've discussed, making sure that if we're doing things differently, that the benefits are not at the cost of other aspects of our well-being or health or whatever else. And I think that's the challenge for it. Some of it's about about common sense. If you'd rather print something out at home to read it because you're sick of looking at screens, do it. That's not digital. It's just a different kind of a piece of paper in that context is a different kind of. It's so. But the other thing is, of course, if this becomes, there is huge consumer demand for more comfortable, better, more or healthier ways to interact, and better screens and so on, then those things will happen. Even if you think about the Kindle, the Kindle is in the consumer context is explicitly a response to those kind of challenges. To screen. And I think that finding ways, and I think really maximising and picking on the things where it's been better for us, and the point Karen made and that I picked up there about it not having to travel is something that's very definitely better for us. It's better for the environment as well. But similarly, sometimes you do want to do things face to face. So I kind of think it'd be nice if we all think about the design of our organizational activities or our business activities in terms of maximizing the value of human interactions when we have them face to face. So it's, you know, don't make it about doing some admin, make it about actually getting to know that person better, because that's a good thing to do in business. I'm just trying to pick up on see if there's anything else. We've got about 10 minutes left and we've covered loads of ground. I'm just if there's anything else. The point about well-being and we've just looked at. There's another point from Andrew there, which is really building on the conversation we've been having around regulation and trust. And I think I'd quite like it to, you know, to just sort of raise the question there if anybody's views on, because I think trust is, for me, the single most valuable commodity in business. It doesn't matter how you're doing business. Trust is what is trust saves you money, trust saves you stress, trust is just a great way to ensure that things flow. And obviously there is trust which is driven by the culture of an organization and the way that you interact with the people representing that organization. But there's also this point, and it comes right back to the regulator and the jurisdiction. There's the things that you trust because there's a CE mark on a product, or there's a or a client mark or whatever, or because it's regulated by the FSA or whatever. So I think that being able to understand the jurisdiction's role in creating trust is in a digital by default way is incredibly important. And I think from your point of view, I don't know, really any comments welcome on this. It's the different components of trust in businesses. So for example, Amazon, why do I trust Amazon more than I trust almost any other retailer? Because I know that they'll take my returns without question, and it's easy to do. So I'll buy it, more readily. Are there any other aspects that people particularly want to highlight?
I think just pick up on the organisation and flexible working and everything that is probably going to arise from this crisis. I think everybody's going to be more flexible, and some will work at home and some will work in the office and some will do a combination of both. All of that requires trust within an organisation. I think you and I were talking the other day and we were saying that, if the bass are running and it's a nice time to go fishing, allow somebody to go fishing for that little high water mark, and they'll put the time in the evening, as long as you trust somebody to work. And imagine the winter when it comes around, when we can actually get some maybe daylight, because the old way of working, where you went to work in the dark, you spent all the time during the daylight hours in the office, and then you drove home in the dark. Maybe things will change, and on the well-being side of things, that's great. But you have to have organizational trust and be able to ensure that people are working efficiently, and they'll be happier and they will work better. That's my trust element. But I get your Amazon thing. I trust them because it's a go-to thing for whatever I need. They seem to have everything. And I trust them to handle my accounts and to be secure and to deliver when I need it. And all of that stuff, that's a trust with a client and an organization. But I think within an organization, as we move forward and we do change and adapt our working to a new way of working, trust is the absolute key to it from a management, from everybody's perspective, from an organizational perspective.
So yeah.
I was just going to say, I think the trust piece in terms of, sort of being more flexible. I'll just say one point on that. I really enjoyed, I live in the south of the island as well, Chris, and I really enjoyed end of day walks up to Craig Niche. I really miss that now. So it's not quite the same wandering around Douglas, I have to say, with the horses. But I think for a small jurisdiction as well, and it's the reputation part. Like, our reputation is mission critical. Yeah. As a jurisdiction, because people looking to invest in the island or firms looking to set up or stay in the island, our financial services, have to have confidence in the island and confidence in the reputation and how it's perceived. And this is where the regulator sometimes, it's more difficult sometimes because this adherence to international standards. So your experience, Dick, in terms of the shipping registry and the IMO, it's getting people to to say it's a credible way of certification, and the registry, digital registries and digital certificates. And for us as well, it's making sure that others looking in can know that, like Amazon, it's reliable, it can deliver, and it's safe. It's safe to do business. You're not going to have any issues of reputational challenges or confidence that we can't do what we need to do here. So I think that's the thing as a regulator. What's the standards that we have to meet to ensure that others coming in will know it's a reliable place to do business, and then the branding of being regulated by, say, FSA, the GSC, the ship registry. It's a recognized, credible registration oversight regime. So it's trust is everything. Trust is everything in the business we do here.
And it's interesting Amazon has achieved that trust from various people on this panel by rigorously applying a certain culture. That's not about regulation particularly. That's really been about consistently doing, and I would say consistently being really good at understanding how to use digital technology effectively in the interest of the customer. And they've set out over a long time now. I think I've been a customer there since the mid-90s. But they've constantly applied a set of organizational standards and they've done it through digital channels. And I think in terms of the regulatory element of it, that's just another aspect in certain industries of it's another tick in that box that allows you to trust. And I think being able to extend that trust and making it digital by default is to me the key there. It's all about organizations working together with whatever regulatory and jurisdictional sort of and actually utility things there as well. I think that the importance of being able to trust our bandwidth is important as well. There's an interesting thing in the research we did in preparing for this presentation. Surprised me most was the idea that in some parts of the world, as a direct consequence of what's happened with the COVID crisis, they are actually paying people to come and live in more rural areas in Japan, in Italy, for example, in the States in some cases. They're not looking to import companies anymore. They're not trying to get in with investment that way. They're just saying, no, let's just have digital workers. Yeah. And that, because we don't from an online point of view, and I think the concept of the digital nomad has come up there, which is saying that we tax income, not profits. So you trust infrastructure of, and it's a nice place to go walking around the carp at the end of your walking, or crayfish at the end of your working day. That is a completely different way of looking at this. Look at it as about a place that's a great place to live and work from, because it doesn't matter where you are.
And I think if you talk to the estate agents about what's going on here in the last few months, I think there's a lot of off-island interest because people can live wherever they want to live now. That's going to make a massive difference.
Sure. And the point, of course, is that it's a lot easier for individuals to move than it is for companies.
For sure.
Mm-hmm.
So interesting. Anyway, I think we're getting quite close to the end of our allotted. Rebecca, is there anything that you'd like to sort of bring in at this stage, just in terms of maybe mopping up any questions we might have missed from the floor, or any closing remarks from the Chamber's point of view?
Yeah, no, it's been excellent, and I absolutely, I can't, but I have hosted probably too many, 4 webinars this week for Chamber, and that never would have happened before. I've been able to do it because I can do it from home, I can do it from the office. It's making much better use of my time, hosting Chamber committees via Zoom. Now, I am getting mixed feelings about them. I still have some people saying, oh, not another Zoom, I'm sick of them. So that I think we have to strike that balance. But going digital for Chamber has been my learning curve's been like that in terms of what I've achieved over the last 4 months in allowing Chamber to continue to do the work that it does and connect people, because that's what's important. It's about being able to be there for our members and connect them in with each other. Technology that's there is just phenomenal. It's made life so much easier. So, but I do think it's important to keep that balance. For mental health perspective, we need to get face to face as well. But I think it's equally great. Going forward at Chamber, I actually plan to always have both options. You know, so if you are stuck at home but you'd like to join the meeting, you can do that. Or if you're pushed for time, you haven't got travel time. You know, the fact that we hosted an hour with the Treasury Minister yesterday, you know, that would not have happened 4 months ago, in terms of, you know, he's very busy. He was happy to do something, but literally had 1 hour and no travel time. I said, well, you know, if you're happy to do something by Zoom, we can accommodate that. And it worked, you know, so the opportunities are there. And I think, yeah, absolutely embrace them. As much as the pandemic has caused a lot of devastation, it's also been an opportunity for many businesses to drive themselves forward and adapt to the digital way, which is only a positive thing.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, I think we're bob on time. I'd really like to thank everybody for listening in, for their comments and on the chat and so on, and of course all of the panelists. I really appreciate everyone joining the conversation. It's been good fun. It's been really interesting, and I think a lot of these conversations will continue anyway. So thank you very, very much. And we'll
thanks, Chris. Just to let everybody know that this has been recorded and will be uploaded onto the Chamber YouTube channel. A little bit of technology and digitalisation that I've gone through over the last few months. So we'll share the link, and we'll share it with PDMS as well. So that will go far and wide for everybody to pick up at a later stage.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank
Thanks.
you very much.
Thank you. Thanks all.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.